One of the largest areas that are currently being tested a lot of times in SATs and in other areas is dealing with statistics. So we're going to begin with a little bit of an overview and talking about one of the most important areas of statistics is actually doing sampling and surveys. So we're going to look at sampling techniques and surveys. So first thing to understand is the idea of what's the difference between a population and a sample. So a population, that's the entire group from which you want information. A parameter is some piece of information you want to know about that population. So for example, we want to know what the median household income for Placer County. So here my population is all the households in Placer County. What I want to find out about is what is their median income. So that's what the parameter is. Now the parameter is an exact value. There is an exact median income for Placer County. We just don't know what it is, but it is an exact value. A sample is a subset of that population. So I'm going to go and select a group from all of Placer County, and I'm going to take some data from it. The data that I gather is called a statistic. And that's going to use to estimate whatever I'm trying to find out. So I might go out and randomly select 30 households to determine their income. The statistic is going to vary. So we're always going to have some kind of sampling error because one sample is going to give me one, and that's just variation. Natural variation is going to occur. Even if I made a really, really good sampling and I was really careful in my sampling, we're going to get random variation just by chance. Now, sometimes you can actually encourage bias. Now, bias would systematically favor certain outcomes. So you're not going to get an actual representation of what the real data is because it was biased. Now, where bias comes in is, let's say, if I wasn't careful about my survey and I did all my surveying of Granite Bay residents. Well, this is certainly not going to be a representative sample for all of Placer County. So that would introduce bias. I would not get an accurate measurement for what I'm trying to measure. So, big thing is we want to try to figure out what is the population and what is their sample. So we're going to go through some examples and then you're going to do some. So we have a phone survey is collected from 60 registered voters in Placer County. They are asked who they support for president. So when you look at this, my population is all of Placer County. So it's all the registered voters in Placer County. That's what I care about. My parameter is I'm trying to figure out what percent would support one candidate over another. So it's going to be a variety of different things. There is an exact amount. We just don't know what it is. My sample is simply the 60 voters called. And whatever they would have responded would have been my statistic. So when they go over and businesses work, they do quality control. So if they say Duracell batteries, what they would typically do is they go over and they would randomly select batteries that they have to test. Now, one of the reasons why we do sampling because we can't test every single battery that Duracell has. If we did, we'd ruin every single battery. So one way they might do it is selecting every 50th AA battery that comes in production, automatically gets kicked out, and it gets sent to quality control. They drain it, they figure out how much energy it has, how long it takes to drain it, to make sure the batch is actually okay. So in this case, my population is all of the batteries. So it's all the AA batteries that are currently in production. My sample are actually the batteries selected. So my parameter in this case is what is the battery life? My statistic is, well, how long do those batteries last on average? Okay, another type of one. So a lot of people like America's Got Talent, and they call in to vote who they want to win, who they're supporting. In this case, my population are the viewers. The viewers of America's Got Talent. However, I'm not really doing a random sample right here. People are actually actively choosing to vote. So, but it is still a form of a sample. My sample is just simply the people who called in. So my parameter is what artist or group is most supported by the viewers. My sample is, well, the people who people voted for. So it's not going to be exactly the same, but when you're voting, that's actually a fair kind of way of doing it. Okay, Highway Patrol has set up sensors on Highway 80 to find the average speed of cars traveling between Colfax and Auburn. My population are the cars traveling between Colfax and Auburn. My parameter is the average speed of all those cars traveling between Colfax and Auburn. My sample are the actual cars that had their speeds recorded. And my statistic would be what was the average speed. So it gives you a little bit of an idea. Okay, so you're going to do a few right now where you're going to answer similar kinds of questions. Okay, we have different types of samples. One, and one of the best ones, is what's called a simple random sample. Now, a simple random sample, we go over and we take our population, and every individual is equally likely to be selected. We randomly select them. So often this is done by a random number generator or pulling names out of a hat, anything like that where every person has an equal likely chance of being selected. And what's really important is, right, any particular set of group, any set is possible. So I could, let's say if I was looking at your high school and I wanted to randomly select, 50 students, theoretically I could select 30 seniors. That could happen. It would still be a simple random sample. When I want to break up things so I have equally likely for each group, that's what we call a stratified random sample, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, there's two different kinds of convenient samples, and they're both really convenient samples. But the voluntary response sample I want to specifically talk about because there's a lot of issues associated with the voluntary response. A voluntary response is when you have some kind of organization invites somebody to call in or to mail in a response, or respond to some kind of a survey voluntarily. So they're not actually demanding it, they're not picking up, they're just putting out a general request to the public and say, hey, how do you feel about this issue? A convenient sample, and that is a type of convenient sample, but another type of convenient sample is just like going out to a certain area and just picking people as they go by. It's a convenient sample. So it's not set up like a simple random sample where everybody's equally likely to be selected. So that's what a convenient sample looks like. We're kind of getting a group that's in a convenient area. Systematic sampling, well, systematic sampling is where I take like every fifth one. So this is again like in productions and things like that, it makes a lot of sense. So I'm just going to take every fifth one. The danger with systematic samples, if there was an inherent pattern in the process, it could throw off our data. Cluster sampling is where I break up my population into clusters, like say neighborhoods. And then I randomly select a cluster and then survey everybody in that cluster. So it would look kind of like this. This is kind of makes it a little more convenient, but it gets more randomness involved. A stratified sample is one of the better ones because let's say I need to get representation from each group. So here I break them up in different strata that have a similar characteristic, and then I draw from those. Now a census is when I select everything. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to go back to our original surveys and samples we had, and plus one other one, and then you're going to see if you can determine which one it was, and then we're going to go over it. Okay, so let's take a look at what type of sample was taken. So we have a phone survey is conducted from 60 registered voters in Placer County on who they support for the presidential election. This would be classified most likely as a simple random sample. Depends on the way it was structured, but right now we're just simply assuming it's going to be a simple random sample. Quality control, every 50th battery in production. This was an example of a systematic sample. They're taking every 50th one. America's Got Talent, the call-in. This is a voluntary response sample. Doesn't mean a voluntary response sample is always bad, but in this case, people vote who they want. But everybody has a chance to vote, but it's voluntary. You don't have to vote. Highway Patrol sets up sensors on Highway 80 to find the average speed of cars traveling between Colfax and Auburn. This is a form of a convenient sample. They're just taking them all. Not getting every single car, they're just going over doing it for a short period of time, so that's why it'd be classified as a convenient sample. Okay, here's our extra one. Say students at Delaware High School are asked to voice their opinion on the new intervention schedule. 25 students are randomly selected from each class, in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. This is an example of a stratified random sample, and in this kind of a case, it's probably the most appropriate one, because we want to hear the opinions from different classes because they're going to have different experiences. So it would be wrong to simply say, I'm going to check, just survey just seniors. So we want to see a representation from each of the different groups. Semi-stratified random sample is one of the better ones to use. Okay, so let's take a look at the voluntary response sample and some of the issues associated. So a voluntary response sample, again, is where you have a general request sent out to the public, and then people voluntarily respond. So maybe something like this. So a radio station asks people if they support background checks to purchase bullets. So I want you to think about that for a second and think about the issues. Okay, this is highly biased. So again, discuss with your team and then enter an answer. Okay, so when we see something like this is going to be very biased because it depends on the radio station. People who have strong opinions are the ones who are going to call in. So we're going to get different results. Let's say if it was done in San Francisco versus we do it up in Auburn. We're going to get completely different responses based on how people feel about this particular proposition that's coming up. So here's another example. So in 1989, San Francisco Giants played the Oakland A's in the World Series. Now, Channel 3, they were the ones that actually broadcasted the A's games in the region. They gave two different phone numbers. And on the phone numbers, you would call one of the numbers if you said, I think the Giants are going to win. You call another one if you said, I think the A's are going to win. So you didn't talk to anybody. It just simply recorded the phone calls. So they started this at like 6 o'clock in the evening news, and they said, we'll report our results at 11, when they did the evening news at 11. So the A's had a much better record. They were favored to win the series. In fact, they did win the series in 4 games. So I want you to, again, discuss with your team, and then write down, what do you think the results of this survey was? Okay, so now I'm going to show you what happened in the survey. That was the result. And you think, well, how the heck could this happen? Well, it so happens that I'm a Giants fan. So I saw them doing this survey at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock when they started it. And there's a redial button on my phone. So I sat while watching TV and just kept hitting redial, redial, redial all night long. So I figured I did about 50% of the votes. I'm a Giants fan, so I was voting Giants. I actually thought the A's would win, but I was going to support the Giants. And being a statistics teacher, I decided to mess up their survey. So it's kind of a good example to think about when you think about voluntary response, what can happen. Okay, simple random sample is one of the most common ones, but it's also sometimes one of the most difficult ones to do. The key to a simple random sample is that every set of n, so if I'm going to select 30 people, I can be able to get any 30 people. So each person is equally likely, but every set of 30 would be equally likely. So I could theoretically say if I'm going to survey a high school, and I'm going to randomly pick 30 people, I theoretically get all 30 people being seniors. That's what makes it a simple random sample. So common techniques they're going to use. They'll use table random numbers. Less common now. Usually they're going to use computer-generated numbers. And they basically assign each individual a number. Could be alphabetical, order of entrance, whatever it may be. Student ID numbers. And then they use some kind of random number generator. Currently, the most common form people would use would be some form of technology that just randomly selects them. Convenient sampling, again, like the voluntary response sampling I mentioned earlier, this one is done typically by a lot of non-professional groups will go out and do convenient sampling. If you've ever had a teacher ask you to do a survey, students are going to do a convenient sample. They're going to go over and ask students they see around them. They're not doing any kind of technique to randomly select students. They're just simply going over and asking who they see. So they're going to ask people because they're going to be at a particular location, particular time. It makes it convenient. It's easy to get the data. The results often are not very reliable because the people they're choosing in that area may have some similar characteristics which would not be representative of the entire population. So for example, if I did a survey conducted Roosevelt Galleria on a Wednesday afternoon, and the intention of the survey is to find out the population of unemployed individuals in the area. I did a sample of 500 shoppers taken. The sample is large, but it's not reliable. So again, I want you to discuss this with your team and then say, why do you think this would not be a good representation? Okay, so now, if you look at this sample right here, if people were not working, they're going to be possibly at the mall. So people who are working are not going to be at the mall. So that's why you're not going to necessarily get a good example. There's probably other ones. Maybe you came up with some. Stratified random sample. This one's really useful when you have certain groups which have different characteristics and you want to get representation. So it could be based on the area. It could be based on a health history, grade, gender. So grade would be like you're in school. Anything like that. We want to go over, we want to break them up because we want to get representation. So males may respond to something different than females. Or you may have sophomores have a different opinion than seniors. Or you may have one geographical area may respond differently than another. So we do a stratified random sample to be sure that we have representation of all of them. And then once it's done, we do a simple random sample, that's what the SRS stands for, on each group. Then we randomly select from within each group. So each group is a simple random sample, but the entire sample is not. Because theoretically, I could not get everybody from one of the strata. So that's the difference between a stratified random sample and a simple random sample. So sometimes you can do multi-level ones where you start off with state, and you break down to county, region, neighborhood. So other types of sampling is like a census. This is where you try to take the entire population. Now, a census is intended to get an exact value. Cluster sampling is where we divide them again into smaller clusters. We mentioned this before. And what we're going to do is we're going to take and then randomly select some cluster and then test everything in the sample. So the battery company, again, this might be a good example of going over and just going in after they've gone through the shipment, going over and grabbing so many packs and then testing those. Each pack will be a cluster and they'll test the entire pack. Now, if they find those are bad, they may decide to throw out the entire shipment of batteries before they send it out to the public. Okay, you're going to have several kinds of questions that you're going to answer individually now and inside your teams to go over and look at the different things we talked about today. Before we do this, some cautions and problems. Some things do happen with surveys. We can run into undercoverage, and that's where some groups are left out or underrepresented. So sometimes the census has this problem. Even though they're trying to get everybody, they have trouble necessarily getting all the people, and the ones they get undercoverage on, sometimes things like the the homeless and some others, they have to make estimates to try to compensate. Non-response is a big problem. One of the issues with non-response is that individuals chosen cannot be reached or refused. So you see this all the time. People call on a phone survey and people just don't answer, or they say, I'm not going to answer. So that's a non-response. And that does throw your answers off because a non-response, the people who are choosing it may have a common characteristic that you may be interested in. Response bias, and this one comes up a lot of times because people have a desire to please. And what happens is, if you go over and you ask somebody a question, for example, you're saying, if you go over and you're standing outside a church one day and you're surveying people, do you want to support this program for the poor? And somebody really doesn't want to do that, they're not going to say no. They're going to say, oh, yes, of course, because they don't want to look bad. That's a desire to please. So they want to make sure that they have a chance to that they don't look bad in front of the person that they're doing the survey. Now, wording of questions, these are leading questions to generate a particular response. So we're going to look at an example of this, and that's one of the things you're going to be looking at when you guys break up into groups. So let's say we're looking at this one. There's a current proposition right now going out. It's Proposition 55 about taxes to support school. So Proposition 55, this is one of the ways that the question could be presented. So Proposition 55 prevents billions in budget cuts without raising taxes by ensuring the wealthiest Californians continue to pay their fair share. Failure to pass Prop 55 could result in devastating cuts and teacher layoffs. This is actually coming right from the people who are pushing a particular view on Proposition 55. Then they ask, okay, do you support Proposition 55? So this is a leading question where they're trying to go over and get a certain result. So you should think about it, okay, what are they trying to get people to respond? Now, here's another way it could have been done. In 2012, voters approved Prop 30, tax increase, because we were promised that it'd be temporary and end in 2017. Now special interests want to break that promise and extend these tax hikes 12 more years. California has a balanced budget, we reduced debt, increased school spending, put billions into California's rainy day fund, and still have a $2.7 billion budget surplus. Do you support Prop 55? Okay, the special interests, of course, they're talking about, of course, schools is a special interest because they want to see the money still continue. But they're trying to get a different response. So you can see this is why, one of the reasons why you want to learn some things about statistics and why this is important is you need to be aware as a consumer, as a voter, that people are trying to influence the way you view. And that's why it's important for you to do some research. Okay, so now you're going to break up and then you're going to see about answering those questions.